gentlemen, join MythVision's Patron not only to support us, but there are 72 videos that I did with Dr. Dennis R. MacDonald and Richard Carrier, all on the Patron, early access. You guys can ask personal questions when I go to interview these scholars, and you're helping MythVision grow. Dr. Richard Carrier, finally, man, in person, MythVision podcast.
Yeah, it's pretty awesome.
It is. This will be our first recording, and I've got some Patron questions, so thanks to Patron members for...
Looking forward to it. That's a really great idea. So
awesome. Gordon Bell, he asks, and this is what how he phrased it. So if ever there's like a spelling issue, I'm reading it as it is.
That's totally fine.
I'm a fundamentalist for my patrons. Would like to ask Rick if he thinks it's possible that many of the stories written were written to explain things, like the story of Job. The Jews knew that prayer did nothing, and they needed a story to explain why prayer did not work, even for the most pious of men. Many of these stories are written to either embellish a character or explain away why God is the way he is. Also, still dislike your MythVision announcement at the beginning of your videos. It's just lame, but still going to donate because I want you to ask Rick this question for me.
I mean, the answer is obviously yes. Yeah, I mean, all of these stories, even stories within the stories, right? Because you've got like Genesis. There's a bunch of stories in Genesis. It's not just one long story. They all serve purposes, right? They're all trying to teach something about something. And that's true for myth in general. In my book on the historicity of Jesus, I've got in chapter 10, I have a whole early section where it's just about what do scholars know about mythology and myth writing? What was myth written for? What does it accomplish, and how is it constructed? Why were these stories told? And it's exactly what he's talking about there. It's like we have some sort of social or moral problem. We need to tell a story that explains it away, or provides a solution for it, or something like that. And so you get an apologetic story like that. And I'm reminded of the comedian David Cross tells us one story about... he was hearing a pastor give some speech or something, and the pastor decided to tell a story. He's like, and I was on this airplane, and there was someone sitting next to me, and they were doing something weird, and I asked them what they were doing, and I'm not doing this justice, by the way. David Cross is a way funnier comedian than me. So he tells the story, a long drawn out, and he said, the person turns to them and says, I'm a member of the Satanist whatever, and we are praying for the destruction of the world, or something like that. And David Cross goes, that didn't happen. And but you see this a lot. Like pastors will tell this long story, and you could be very suspicious as to whether that story is true.
Yeah,
they're telling it because they want some lesson. It's a parable, right? Yeah. There's some lesson, and this is exactly what Jesus does. So, like in Mark, for example, Mark 4, Mark kind of gives us a clue to this. He's sort of a cipher for all Gospels, where Jesus is preaching. He's telling these stories, just like these kinds of stories. Like, you know, there was this guy on a road, and then this thing happened, and he'll tell these stories. But then he turns and he says to everybody, "Let everyone with an ear, let them hear." Right, and then he immediately turns to his disciples in private, and they're asking him, like, "What are the meaning of these stories you're telling?" And it's like, "What, you don't know?" Like, so to you, I'm going to tell you the secret meaning of the story, like what it means. But I'm not going to tell that to the public, because if I do, then they'll turn and be saved, right? Which is a weird thing for Jesus to say, right?
Wouldn't he want everybody
but
to be saved?
Right. So it captures the exact point of mythology, is in-group and out-group logic, right? Is to say, we're going to tell this story. If you don't get it, you're not one of us. And so the idea is, like, if you do get it, then you'll want to be one of us. You'll join, you get initiated, then we'll tell you the rest of it. Like, we'll say, like, this is what really the story is about. This is what it's really for, and so on. But outsiders, it's just this seemingly literal story, this myth. And if they take it literally, they're the ones who are damned, right? They're the ones who are not going to be saved. It's the people who look at it allegorically and figure out the real meaning are the ones who are saved. So it's really funny when you see this in there, and you look at modern fundamentalism, which is based on literalism and inerrantism and stuff like that, is they're obsessively driven to be the outsiders that Jesus is condemning in Mark, right?
Right.
Rather than being the people who go, actually, you're not supposed to take it literally, right? You're supposed to actually find the hidden meaning. And yes, all mythology, and that's not weird. That's actually in context of the ancient world. That is how mythology operated. It had these stories. The insiders would get it, right? But, outsiders would just see this weird, stupid story, right? And so that's the way myths were constructed that way. And if you were an insider, you could use these myths. They'd be very moving. This very moving story, like Job that you mentioned. Like, oh yeah, let me tell you a story about why life sucks and God doesn't do anything about it. And it's this big long story, and then this happens to him, and then this happens to him. It's get the most horrible conditions possible, and then in the end, it's this big speech by God that explains everything. I can do whatever I want, basically, is his thing. And yeah, that was their answer to it. I mean, it's a terrible answer, but it's what they wanted to promote. It's kind of the only thing you can argue.
Yeah, what can you do when divine hiddenness is there the whole time? Your own story said he was showing up at tabernacles and things like that with clouds of his presence.
Yeah, and then they'll tell a story as to why he stopped doing that, right? And
it's always an excuse when the original myth gives this idea that he's walking with Adam.
And if you notice, so Job is interesting because it starts with Satan as God's bud. Satan is God's agent. In fact, God tells Satan to go do all these horrible things to Job. And Satan is in heaven as among the angels of God. So at this point, Job was written before the intertestamental change in the mythology where Satan became a rebel against God and had his rebellion and stuff. So it was written before that. At that point, Satan is just the adversary in the legal sense. The term means someone who's supposed to be next to the king and play devil's advocate, as we say now. Literally, that was the role they were supposed to take. So they were actually a part of the king's court and thus part of God's court. And so it didn't mean anything like enemy of God or anything like that. It just meant someone who's supposed to argue with God so that God can have a sounding board, basically. But anyway, God sends Satan to do all these horrible things. I think he has a bet with Satan even. And but later you get to a few hundred years after Job is written, the evolution was Judaism absorbed the Zoroastrian idea of the duality of the world, of the evil God and the good God who fight each other. And so they had to come up with, how do we have the evil God? We've never had an evil God fighting our God before, right? That would work, right? You can't say Baal.
Solving the problem of evil.
Right. So what they do is they come up with, Satan, he's adversary. We can associate him with all the bad stuff. Say he rebelled against God and was kicked out of heaven, and then everything that's gone wrong since then is all Satan's fault. And God has a plan to fix this. He's going to fix it. It's just, he's getting there. He's just got to be patient for when he gets there to fix it. And that was the apocalypse, right? The apocalypse is when Satan or God would finally overthrow Satan and fix everything Satan screwed up. That's the new narrative. So that's a different answer than the Job answer. The new answer is it works a little bit better, right? It still has problems in the sense of the omnipotence of God seems to not be a feature in this story. But it actually at least doesn't make God the asshole. Right?
Exactly.
Right? So that's actually a better way of telling the story. And I think that's why they borrowed it. Because that version of the story made more sense than continually excusing God by saying, God can do whatever he wants. And I was that's not really a good answer. No, but to change that to, God is going to do, God knows, God trust us. God knows he's going to fix everything. You just got to be patient. And then the narrative they would use is the prophetic narrative. The only reason God hasn't fixed it yet is because Israel keeps sinning. And if you just stop sinning, and so it's all your fault, right? That became the narrative that was very effective as a marketing tool. So much so that it's still a component of Christianity today, right? Is that the only reason God hasn't come and fixed everything is because we're so fallen and we're just not getting with it. We're not enough of us are praying for God to come or whatever, right? So it's similar kind of thinking still exists today. But that holds based on a myth, right? The myth of Satan warring against God, a legion of angels there's a whole historical narrative that's completely made up, but they believed it and sold it as actual literal history. Now there might be some of them that would give a allegorical interpretation of it, but usually it was sold as literal. This actually happened. There was actually a Satan at some historical point actually rebelled against God. He's one of God's angels. He took a legion of angels with him. All the demons are the children of these dark angels and earthly human women. And they have this whole bizarre narrative, and you find it in the Book of Enoch, by the way. Or at least find a lot of this in the Book of Enoch, which was a foundational text for Christianity. Christianity is built on the myth of Enoch. It's built on all of this. So it's mythology built on top of mythology, on top of mythology, is the way it works. And it's all just explain stuff. There's certain things we want to explain, certain values and ideas we want to promote, so we're going to tell a story. That's how we're going to do it. And it's just like Jesus does with the parables. He has a particular message, a particular moral point of view, a particular way of behaving, a solution for a social problem, and he does it, the way he's portrayed as doing it in the Gospels is he tells a story. The story is not literally true, right. But it is supposed to represent something that you're supposed to learn about from the parable, and so that represents how mythology writing generally operated. And then you had the two different camps of thought, which is we can accept the myth as not literal and just go for the allegory. And then the people who started to no, the myth has to be true, becomes sort of rhetorically important for the myth to be true, because if the myth isn't true, then the message somehow can't be true, because fiction is fiction, right? Mm-hmm. So you get this literalist movement. It rises. You see it in the 2nd century already. You see these literalists are saying, no, these things are true, as opposed to the ones who are saying, no, they're allegories for something. The allegorical camp got shut out, basically. They lost the war for control of the church. But we see this exact same debate among the rabbis. So it's nothing new about this debate. We see it in the rabbinicals. You look at the Talmud, there's an argument about, there's a passage in Ezekiel where it's called the Valley of Dry Bones, where Ezekiel gives this big, long passage about how he looked at this valley full of bones and he saw them, the flesh form on them, and they rose from the dead. And there's the two camps of rabbis who are arguing over this. And one is saying it's an allegory for the future resurrection of Israel. It's and even just allegory for the political reunification of Israel, right? It's not even necessarily about a resurrection, literally. So they're saying, no, it's just an allegory. But there was a whole camp of rabbis that says, no, it literally happened, and my Uncle Joe claims to be descended from one of the resurrected people. So they literally have made up our own family history to sort of justify the literalism of this story.
Oh, wow.
And so for that camp, it was necessary that it be true, because that proves God's power, that proves resurrection is real. If you say it's an allegory, you're basically shitting on their whole belief system and their whole family history.
Right.
And so it's necessary for that camp that it be true. But there's the other camp that doesn't need it to be true. And when you look at the history of Christianity, it's the literalists that actually take over the church and start to dominate, and then eventually get Constantine's ear, and they're the ones who run the church thereafter.
You're damned if you do and damned if you don't, though, because
this
I deal with a lot of people on MythVision, as you can see the kind of content that I do. A lot of the people on MythVision that I engage with, they come on and they'll go, let's say I'm jabbing at the idea of a physical resurrection, or I'm jabbing at some idea that sounds to be literal.
Sure, yeah.
Okay, that right there alone, they go, see, you're an idiot. You don't know what it's talking about. And these are people who are not in the church, right? But they claim to have the truth.
Yeah.
And they'll be like, it's allegory, you idiot. Well, for those who think that, I want to go ahead and address the elephant in the room and say, Dr. Carrier is a self-proclaimed atheist, someone who does not ontologically believe any of this, right, to be as truth. He understands your master's parables, my friends. Because what they've done is they want to save the face of the text and of Jesus and things like that to still keep and restore some type of spirituality based off of it, right? So they want to take away anything literal, take away the physical, take away the actual, he didn't mean pluck your real eye out and throw it into the fire, allegory for just stop doing it or whatever. Okay.
If they did that consistently, that would be great.
Yeah.
Right? If you say, oh, yeah, it's all allegory. Oh, okay, we're on the same camp then. We're good to go.
Yeah, but then they make it mean whatever, though. See, this is the thing they start to do. Yeah. They get into these really strange interpretations.
Well, this is the argument. This is an argument, one of the arguments that Hector Avalos made in his book, The End of Biblical Studies. And the whole theme of that book is, I'm trying to argue to the public that I should be fired. It's basically that I should be out of a job. And so the whole book is we're devoting too many resources, too many personnel to biblical studies. You make the comment we have tens of thousands of Babylonian tablets that are sitting untranslated for want of personnel to go in and translate them. We know the University of Chicago, I think alone has tens of thousands of Greek and Latin and other language papyri that are just foundering there untranslated for want of personnel to translate them. All these other cultures are getting neglected, and tons and tons of personnel are just pouring in, writing a zillion commentaries on the same single book of the New Testament, right? And this argument is there should be fewer of us. We should be a specialty discipline. We should be spreading out more and covering more of human history. Mm-hmm. And so he goes to it, and he first completely annihilates fundamentalist scholarship and explains how bogus that is. But then he has a whole section on liberal scholarship, the scholarship that tends to get it right, or at least is going in the right direction. He says even that is valuable when it's just scholarship, but it's often deployed for liberal Christian apologetics. The example would be trying to argue that the Bible never says anything against homosexuality, right? And so that's a version of sort of specious exegesis of the text, both New and Old Testament.
Right.
But it is pushed as scholarly, as we're giving the historical context, we're looking at the original language and all of this stuff, and we're proving our point. It's the same thing, but Hector Avalos' point is this is just as bogus, right? Why are we even bothering with this? What does it matter if the New Testament or Old Testament promotes homosexuality or not? it's a primitive text written by people 2,000 years ago who didn't know what they're talking about most of the time, right? So we shouldn't be basing our lives on this. There's so much more literature we could be looking at to find things in, and rather than trying to save the text for the religion. So he has this whole section on liberal Christianity based on that point. And it's similar to what you're saying. Like, you can come at the text and you can make it say anything you want. And this is why the fundamentalists, that's why fundamentalists exist, by the way, is because of that. Because you can go in and you can make it say anything you want, and that, if you notice it, that's a big problem.
Me and Dennis were
because
talking
that
about
means
this the
it's
other
just
night.
human ideas. You're not really getting the word of God. You're just making it say whatever you want. There's no boundaries. There's no limitations to what you can do. So the solution is, say, literalism. Therefore, there's only one way to take it, and so it's the way to force you to
KJV onlyist.
Correct. Now, of course, they end up reinterpreting it in a million different ways anyway.
Right.
But their package, the sell they have, is that we're doing literalism. We are taking the text literally for what it says, and so that's actually more rhetorically useful. It avoids the serious problem of what happens when you admit what you're actually doing, which is just reading into it whatever you want.
Mike Lacona, for example. Getting
famous
fired
case
for Matthew 27, the zombie apocalypse.
Yeah, for people who don't know this, right?
Yeah.
So this is the story. Michael Lacona is a Christian apologist, and with a PhD, he's a full scholar and everything. And he just dared, and he did this huge book on the resurrection. He just dared to suggest this one passage is allegory, right? And it's the passage where in Matthew, Jesus dies, and then all the saints rise out of the graves. And he's very specific. They come out of the tomb. So literal resurrection. So you have this mass resurrection of these, long dead saints, and then come into town and visit people, right? And so there's this mass resurrection appearance. This is a big problem for Christian apologists, because they say, I really don't think a story, if that had actually happened, that this would be the only mention of it in the entirety of the historical record. It also has other problems because it means there was a mass resurrection already before the general resurrection. So there's a theological problem with this. There's a lot of issues that bump up against fundamentalist ideology. So his solution is, no, this is just an allegory for the future resurrection. It wasn't a literal event, and they fired him. He was fired for it. So
And could he be right? Maybe. Maybe, but even then, I'll read it and I'm like, no, I think they're making a claim here, just like they're making a claim about Herod, right? Is that an allegory that we know he mimetically is taking over and trying to kill every 2-year-old?
I think it's both, right? So when you look at Mark, I think Mark very clearly does not, he doesn't expect insiders to take it literally. The whole gospel, I think he means it as allegory, as stories we tell to explain things. When you get to Matthew adds something Mark does not. Matthew keeps adding, and thus this fulfilled prophecy.
Right.
It's making a historical claim. In other words, he's claiming this happened, thereby fulfilling prophecy. So that's the first time we see a historicist mindset in the Gospels. And Matthew's doing this. Now, I think Matthew's also doing tons of allegory, right? It's very obvious. When you look at the empty tomb narrative, it's just all a riff on Daniel in the lion's den, and there's all these other things going on there. So I think he's going for both audiences. He's going for the literalist people, like I mentioned with those rabbis before, the literalist camp. He's going for the literalists, and they can take the text literally. That's fine. But he's also going for the allegorists. So he's all this underlying allegory that can nurture them. That they don't want to take the literal true. They want the allegory. It'll be there for them. So he's hitting both markets, and thus has more people who will like his gospel and use his gospel. So it's actually a brilliant marketing tactic. Wow. When you get to Luke, the historicism gets more blatant. Now he's really modeling historical, historians' prefaces he models. Interestingly, he models the structure of the preface, but lacks all the information that would actually be in a historical preface, like his name, how he knows any of the stuff he's talking about, the names of his sources and things like this. That's the kind of thing we would normally find in a preface: is why should you believe me, and who am I, etc. And so, and even if it's not in the preface, it'll be in one of the chapters that information was common in historicity or historical literature at the time. But no, he's imitating that, so it looks and sounds like, and so you won't notice that he hasn't given you any information, right? But it looks like it, and he puts in details that add dates, and when the census of Quirinius, and then the ministry of John the Baptist begins when all these people were reigning, and so regnal dates is how you would date things. So that looks just like a history, but no one really notices that he only dates the beginning of John the Baptist's ministry, not the ministry of Jesus. He's super vague about when Jesus started, but you're just supposed to sort of assume that it's the same time, but it really that's not what the text literally says. But anyway, so Luke adds all of these historical details, and he's also the first to add the resurrection appearance, where he adds the detail. If you look in Matthew, where it says Jesus appeared to them on the mountain or whatever, and some doubt it.
Right.
It just throws it out there, some doubted. And then you get to Luke, and he says, well, okay, yes, some doubted, but they were convinced, and here's why. And Jesus shows that he eats, you can touch him, he's physical. So this is a big message about what the nature of the resurrection is. So there's competing camps about what the nature of the resurrection is. So Luke is in one camp, and he's using a story to sell his version. So it's clear that he means some people to take this literally, and he wants to convince those people. But I think at the same time, there's a lot of allegory going on. The Emmaus narrative and all of that is just tons of like symbolism happening here. So he's also, I think he's grabbing the allegorical market as well. So he's doing both. By the time you get to John, John has tons of allegory in there as well, but he is repeatedly adamant that this actually happened and you're damned if you don't believe it, that kind of stuff. And I'm telling you these stories and they really happened. People were really there and saw it, and so we're telling it to you now so that you will believe. Like he explicitly tells you what his motive is.
He is trying to make you believe.
Yeah, and so he really
like a whole nother level of it.
He takes Luke's touching the body narrative and really like elaborates it out into the Thomas Didymus touching the wounds, and like it's more detail, right? And this gets to something that maybe we'll talk about a little bit more later. Is one of the common things that I find with Christian apologetics is the what I've started to call formalized gullibility. It's like gullibility as a methodology. And I did this with the Craig Evans debate. He did this a lot in that debate, where it's like, well, it's so vividly described, it must be a memory, right? and it's like that goes, and that's really gullible, right? First of all, but also it goes against everything we know about literature. When you look at going classics in ancient history, in my field of history, they say the opposite. It's like the more elaborate and vivid it is, the more you should doubt it, right? So when you look at like the battle of there's this battle by Alexander the Great, this famous one where he crosses a river and stuff, and there's different versions of what happened. And then there's one version where Alexander the Great goes to meet the Persians there. They camp overnight, and then he sneaks his army down, crosses the river, fords the river, comes over and ambushes them in the morning, right, or just before morning. And then there's the version where they clash in the middle of the river, and Alexander charges down with his horse and his gleaming helmet and his flowing plume and all of this stuff. And that is fiction, right? That didn't happen. Obviously, Alexander. Right. And so it's like all of these details. The more detail you see like that, the less likely it's a memory. The more likely this is literary embellishment. There's something else going on here. And this is also true in urban legends. So you go and look at the urban legend literature. One of the points that the scholars in this field make is that the urban legends get more specific historical details added over time. And then the details will all be shifted out when you want to move the legend to a different location, right? So if it moves from one state to another, all the little markers will now have been transformed to markers familiar to people in that state or that city or whatever, right? And so over time, these urban legends acquire these veneer of historical details. So Christian apologists act like it's the other way around. Oh, look at all these historical details in Luke. It must be true. It's like, actually, that is a sign that it isn't true. Because you look at the progression from a total urban legend in Mark to something being slightly historicized in Matthew. And now you have Luke totally historicized, putting in all these details that weren't there before, right? So that's actually, for us, really suspicious to historians. But Christian apologists have the gullible, oh, no, it's more detailed. It's got to be true. They're not looking at this in context of how these texts get created and changed over time.
So Gordon Bell, when he said, also still dislike your MythVision announcement at the beginning of your videos, it's just lame, but still going to donate. I think that's an allegory. I think he doesn't mean that literally. I think there's definitely some allegory here. So Gordon, I know that there's a secret message you're trying to convey, but thank you, Dr. Carey. I appreciate it.